Okay, we're back from our break, and we're going to move from Byzantium and the Western Empire, well, actually the Eastern Western Empire, and we're going to move eastward to China and look at the Han Empire. So China, the origins of imperial China is what we're going to look at first. Again, we're moving eastward, and here's our world map. You see the Roman Empire is around the Mediterranean, and we're moving eastward to the yellow part, which is the Wei River Valley. And when we looked at Shang and Zhou China, this is exactly where Shang and Zhou China started, in the Wei River Valley, right here in this yellow part. And this is actually where the Han Empire begins too. It begins first with the Qin Empire, but we're going to recall that the Shang Empire, 1750 to 1027 BC, the Shang was not an empire, and the Zhou Dynasty, 1027 to 221 BC, and here is the Zhou Dynasty. They might be compared to the Greek states. In fact, historians often compare them to the Greek states because there's a lot of conflict and competition, differing languages and cultures, and distinctive elements of national culture are welded out of a lot of differing elements. And this is often compared to what is happening in the Greek states. I have to tell you, I don't really agree with that, but that's what a lot of historians say. And we'll be asking some of those questions today about whether this is true. Around 221, well, the Zhou Empire, if you remember, was finished with the Warring States period, and we have these kings who were fighting each other in the Warring States, and then they become gods, as you're seeing here. These are representation of the Warring States kings. The Qin state of the Wei Valley began about 221 BC. It conquered all its rivals and created the first Chinese empire. The Qin Empire was built at great cost in human lives. Its founder was Shi Huangdi, who was its first emperor, and so this Shi Huangdi, I think, means first emperor. His prime minister was Li Si, and they were able and ruthless men and exploited the exhaustion of the interstate rivalry. And what happened was, again, the different factions of the Zhou period fought each other to a standstill, and the Qin arose to take advantage of that situation. The Wei River Valley is on the fringes of that area, again like Assyria and Rome, less urbanized and less commercialized. And what pulled it all together was that the king was stronger than the nobles, largely because, remember, in the Wei River Valley you have a lot of trouble with flooding and the need for building canals and dam building, and again, this need for organization meant that there were strong kings. The strong kings then remained strong, and so you have the development of a totalitarian state within in the first Qin Empire, and it was ruthlessly totalitarian. The individual was completely subordinated to the state. And here we see the Qin Empire forming out of the chaos and the civil wars of the Zhou Empire. To me, this reminds me of the civil wars of the Roman Republic, ending up in becoming a stronger Roman Empire, but not totalitarian as the Qin Empire was. Okay. It was the canal and dam building that allowed the king to organize and get so much power and build a totalitarian state. Legalism was the new school of political thought that grew out of the Qin dynasty, and this is how the emperors justified their actions as absolute rulers. The will of the ruler was supreme, and the subjects were trained in discipline and obedience. There was a rigid application of rewards and punishment. And we see the development for the first time of primogeniture, and this means the right of the firstborn son to inherit everything in the family. Primogeniture was then abolished in favor of multiple heirs to prevent any one family from becoming too strong. So you start out with the custom of primogeniture really left over from the Zhou culture, and the new totalitarianism meant that the king abolished inheritance by one son in order so that no powerful heirs would develop. He split all the possessions among multiple heirs. But he also abolished slavery, and the slavery that had supported the large estates, he now abolished and created a free peasantry, not because he hated slavery and loved peasants, but because he wanted the peasants to pay taxes, and this is how he got his income. So a free peasantry meant that he had a lot of peasants who could pay taxes, and their labor helped support the central government. One of the things that he did that we didn't really see, we sort of saw it in the Roman Empire, the standardization throughout the empire, the weights and measures and coinage were all standardized. I don't know that the Romans standardized weights and measures. They didn't make a point of it, but we did have a standard culture spread like a veneer all over the Roman Empire, and this is true of the Qin Empire too. They built thousands of miles of roads, just like the Romans did, to connect parts of the empire, and they also built walls around the Qin Empire, a precursor to the Great Wall to protect them from the nomads, and we saw that in the 2nd century, the Romans also built walls around their empire. But in the case of the Qin Empire, the emperors were so oppressive that when Shi Huangdi died in 210 BC, rebellions broke out everywhere. And when the dust cleared, Liu Bang, possibly a peasant, prevailed and established the Han Dynasty. Okay, and here we see roads, a mountain road outside of Hong Kong. Liu Bang, who was possibly a peasant, arose to rule the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty soon superseded the Qin Empire, and it lasted from 206 BC to 220 AD, roughly contemporary to Rome, but not quite. It depends on if you consider the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. They're sort of contemporary, but the Roman Republic and Empire lasted actually a lot longer than the Han Dynasty did. But the Han Dynasty is extremely important to China because it's the beginning of a long history of imperial China, and it fostered a political and cultural unity that continued until today. And so we see the rise of imperialism because of China. They unified all of China. For example, they started, and I want to go back to the cultural unity and continuity of this imperial idea that was founded in the Han Dynasty that still exists today, because look, for example, at China today and the conflict over Taiwan, for example, and the Chinese idea that they still own Taiwan, that it's not independent, that once a territory is Chinese, it's always Chinese. They've gotten back Macau and Hong Kong, which they regard as Chinese. And so there's this imperialism that dates back to the Han Dynasty that we see even today. The Han Empire faced greater obstacles than the Roman Empire. Geographically, it was more spread out. It was a much more difficult terrain. They were hooked together by a lot of rivers, and we've seen China, the culture of China is always along its rivers, which are the basis of communication. But Rome had the benefit of the Mediterranean Sea, and a sea is a much better way to communicate than roads or rivers, even through mountains and deserts. The Han Empire claimed to reject the excesses of the Qin, and they tried to restore a venerable past. And so one of the justifications for ruling of the Han Dynasty was a return to the glories of the past. And we can compare that to the Emperor Augustus. When he became the first emperor, What he declared was he was ending all of the civil wars and returning to the traditions of the past. He made a big thing about that. But in reality, the Han Empire maintained much that the Qin had invented with less fanaticism, and the Han system became the standard for later ages. Basically, the Han Empire was agricultural. The main tax was based on the yield of the fields that supported the luxurious court and the military. There were two capital cities, first Chang'an, and later the capital was moved to Luoyang. The Yangtze River Valley was important for food production, and it was connected by canals to the Yellow River. And so this was a very important development to connect the two river systems together, because these are the heart of China. And here you can see on the yellow map, the yellow region, you see the Yangtze to the north and the Yellow River to the south, connecting them together. One of the innovations that the Han Empire did was to take a census to count everybody, to assess the availability of labor. In 2 AD, for example, there were 60 million people that they counted, and this is an increase from 140 BC when there were 49 million people. Most of these people lived in the eastern part of the country, in the river valleys, again centering on the Yangtze River. And every male was expected to work for the state in between seasonal agriculture, so that every male was obligated to work for 1 month for the state. And while he worked, he might be required to build palaces, temples, fortifications, or roads, or he might be required to transport goods, or to excavate mines or fields, to maintain canals, or work on the imperial estates or mines. Writing enabled a bureaucratic government to keep elaborate records. And so here we can see these river systems, which are the heart of the Han Empire, that tied the heart of China together. And one of the things we might notice is the movement of Chinese culture southward, so that when we think of China today, it's really the Yellow River that we think of as the heart of China. It started in the south and in the north, in the Wei River Valley on the Yangtze, and it moves ever southward until the south becomes the heart of the empire. The first 80 years marked consolidation of the whole empire. And under the Emperor Wu, who ruled from 140 to 87 BC, we have a period of military expansion that was launched, and they expanded dramatically. And here again, this reminds you of the Roman Empire, where they moved into Fujian to the south, and Guangdong, Vietnam, and in the south, pushing into Southeast Asia even, and north into Manchuria and North Korea. And at the same time, they moved westward into Mongolia and Xinjiang to secure the Silk Road. So that this became a period of great expansion. And again, we can compare that to the Roman Empire. They did something the Roman Empire did as well, and that is to found military colonies on the fringes of the outside world. As they conquered places, they set up military colonies along the frontier, and they built roads to connect everything within the empire to every other part of the empire. They pushed the nomads ever back and away, and this empire endured for about 400 years. And again, it kind of depends on, they're not exactly parallel, and I would kind of quarrel with your textbook about whether this was an age of empires or not. But regardless of whether you agree with that or not, I mean, there are parallels with Rome, but there are also enormous differences with Rome. And I want to show you some, these are modern pictures, but just to get an idea of Chinese life as the empire expanded. And here you can see a house. This is a vase, by the way. But you can see a house with a Chinese caller leaving his horse outside. And looking out the window, here are some Chinese women. And here are the writing implements again that allowed the bureaucracy to be formed. And the bureaucracy is the key to holding the empire together. And this reminds you of Rome as well, building a bureaucracy. And here are soldiers, the military going out to conquer. And here they have to cross a river. Okay, and here is one of those soldiers. Okay. The Han Chinese expanded at the expense of other ethnic groups and opened up frontiers with military colonists. And here we see some of the poor people of the Chinese Empire. Here's a cobbler. These are the peasants, of course, that were exploited. This is another cobbler. And here's a Chinese farmhouse, so in the countryside the farmers are exploited. And here we see a map of the Han Empire as it's reaching its furthest extent, and you can see how far southward it's expanded into the southern part into Vietnam, and the northern part into Manchuria to the north, and the eastern part along the Silk Road and all the way down the Silk Road, so that you can see this expansion. Because the Chinese were relatively considered very civilized by all their neighbors, and their neighbors envied them and saw them as having a lot more expertise, actually a lot of these areas on the outskirts of the Chinese Empire actually invited the Chinese in to share their expertise with them and to help them develop their culture. And by doing this, the Chinese pushed the nomadic peoples back. They expanded into the tropical forests of the south, but they avoided the steppes and the deserts. And so you can see that they've expanded through the interior lands, but they've avoided the high mountains and the deserts to the south. The Han Empire endured for 400 years, from 202 to 8 BC, which was the early Han Empire, or the Western Empire, and then we have the later or Eastern Han Empire from 23 to 220 AD. Okay. Chang'an was the capital, and we're not surprised to know that that capital was in the Wei River Valley, again in the north of the Yangtze River. It became the model for other cities built throughout the empire, and this can remind you of the Roman cities. Remember that Rome became the model for all the cities throughout the empire, and every city in the empire was a little replica of Rome, and this is exactly what happened in the Chinese cities. Chang'an became the model for the other cities. It was built on a grid plan like the Roman cities, and they had urban planning. Unlike Houston, they had zoning so that they didn't have wild growth from one region to another. And it was carefully planned, and we had multi-story houses within the empire. This marked a rise in prosperity and a general standard of living, education, and literacy and trade. We also have a period of peace and stability. Often this is called the Pax Sinica during the Han Empire, when there was peace throughout the empire and no civil wars. We can compare that to the Pax Romana in the Roman Empire, a period of peace without warfare. And later on we'll discover that the Islamic Empire also has a period of peace called the Pax Islamica. And what they share in common is a huge region controlled where trade and interchange of culture can take place without civil wars, without the impediments of wars and pirates and robbers and other things of that kind. The emperor was still the son of heaven, and he still ruled by the mandate of heaven. So the basic concepts of Chinese culture are still in place from the old Shang dynasty. So let's look at the Han Empire again for the Pax Sinica, the peace of this huge empire, this complete peace. And here's a grid plan that the cities are made on, and here are some of the people. This is a court where you could. This is actually a military court where you can see the military men. These are modern, 19th century. And here is a city. You can see that this city is. You can almost see the grid plan that it's planned on, a view of Peking. and the multi-story buildings that make up the city. Here's the city gate. And the tenements. This is in a modern city again, but multi-story buildings. Again, the emperor was at the center. He stood at the center of government and society like a father to the family. And again, remember that in the early part of Chinese history, the Shang and Zhou, we had the establishment of the family as the key unit, and the state was the family writ large. And so that tradition continues with the emperor as a kind of father to the whole state. The family was a link between the living generations and the ancestors, and the emperor himself served as the same kind of link between the living and the ancestors and was supreme in the state. He brought the support of powerful imperial ancestors and guaranteed the harmonious interaction of heaven and earth. And in fact, the emperor was regarded as a god on earth. But the mandate of heaven could be withdrawn, and we would know about it if there were natural disasters or successful revolutions. That would be proof of the emperor's failure. So he ruled as long as he enjoyed the mandate of heaven. The emperor himself lived in seclusion within the walled palace compound, and he had many wives and eunuchs and courtiers. And around the royal court there was an unceasing round of pomp and ritual besides the practical business of government. Okay, and so here we can see the family, the paterfamilias, the Chinese family. That's the heart of all of Chinese society, and the emperor is the family writ large. I put these in here, these little figures, because they represent the ancestors, and often they would show the, is that right, Maria? Maria's working on China right now. The ancestors, so that we can see the reverence for age and for the ancestors, and here is an aged god, an ancestor as a god. The central government was run by a prime minister and a civil service director, and there were 9 ministers in the government for record keeping, the treasury, protocol, security, punishment, ceremonial, and army commanders. The empire itself was divided into commanderies that were commanded by the army commanders, and it was divided also into kingdoms under civil and military authorities, sometimes with subordinate kings. These administrative regions were subdivided into prefectures, districts, and wards. And again, the bureaucracy and the elaborate organization of the empire was what helped it to survive and to last for such a long time. The government depended on local officials to administer the day-to-day business, and again, this is very like the Roman Empire, which had a very elaborate bureaucracy dividing the empire into regions with local officials. The local officials collected taxes and paid them to the central government, and the local officials also conscripted people for the army and labor projects, and they were responsible for local protection and dispute settlement. A significant development at this time was the rise of a class of gentry to control the local aristocrats. A new gentry, a class of kind of country gentlemen who were distinguished by their education and training and moral values. During the expansion, the Han carried with them their social organization, values, and culture. And so these were spread by the country gentry. The basic unit was a family, a living, self-renewing organism, and sons were needed to perpetuate it further. The father ruled in the family. The family inculcated the basic values of Chinese society: loyalty, obedience, and respect for elders and their ancestors. And the hierarchy in the state actually mirrored the hierarchy of the family, and so the state was kind of the family writ large. Another fundamental source of values was Confucianism, and we've already seen that this arose during the Zhou dynasty, but now it's adopted by this new gentry class, and so Confucianism becomes a way of making their mark in the world. It provided them with education and training and moral values, and again, education is a way of social mobility, of rising from the lowest classes to the highest classes. The Imperial University was founded outside Chang'an, and it had 30,000 students. But there were also universities in a lot of the provincial centers of the empire. There was a salaried bureaucracy with 20 different levels so that you could climb up the ladder of the bureaucracy. And there was an examination system based on Confucianism. It was open, it taught loyalty, and it was open to all men except merchants. And the reason it's not open to merchants is because they needed their merchants to make money for the state outside of the bureaucracy. The bureaucrats largely came from the landlord class, and these are the people who governed the Han Empire, the people who were trained in the universities, in the Confucian system. So they had this wonderful education system that led to a wonderful bureaucracy. Okay, here's a student who's going to these Confucian schools. And this is an examination center, and they had examinations. Here are those little booths that you go in to take your exams, and you can see how many there are. There's a huge amount of little booths, and they strike terror into the hearts of the students as they go to take these exams, because their whole future depends on it. It sort of reminds you of modern high schools and the way the students prepare to enter the different colleges that they go to because the exams, like taking the SAT exams, your whole future depends on it. And that's what these Confucian exams were like. And so they're still, this is why education is still such a great value in China. It goes all the way back to the very earliest time of Confucianism in Chinese culture. So education is a very strong value. Taoism was actually founded in 369 to 286 BC, so it's another ancient custom that the Chinese revived at this time that came to prominence again in the Han Empire. It was based on the teachings of Lao Ji and Zhuangzi, which took root in an earlier time but were now revived. It's a religious and philosophical worldview that is strangely exactly the opposite of Confucianism. It's more of a religion of the lower classes, whereas Confucianism was the road to success for the elites. Taoism is more a class for a religion for the lower classes. It emphasized the search for the Tao, or path of nature, and valued harmonizing with the cycles and patterns of the natural world. The search for harmony and a oneness with nature was achieved by solitary contemplation, physical and mental discipline, and striving for inspiration. But it's a kind of intuitive kind of knowledge. It's not the kind of knowledge you learn through book learning like Confucianism is, where you read a lot of books. It's more like you look into yourself and examine yourself, and you wait for a moment of inspiration. It's almost a spiritual thing where you get inspired, a moment of intuitive grasping of the nature of things. And the rise of Taoism in the Han Empire called into question the age-old beliefs and values. It rejected the hierarchy and the rules of Confucianism. I'm wondering if we can compare this at all to Christianity coming into the Roman Empire and utterly turning around the basis of all Roman culture. Taoism didn't make that kind of a change in China. It more existed side by side with Confucianism, so both of them survived together, whereas in the Roman Empire you see the triumph of Christianity wiping out most of the ancient Roman religions. Again, Taoism called into question the age-old beliefs and values and rejected the hierarchy and rules of Confucianism. It urged passive acceptance of the disorder of the world and denial of ambition. So it's more of a seeking of knowledge. It reminds me a little bit of the Gnostics. Remember in early Christianity where the Gnostics looked for spiritual intuition and intuitive knowledge. On the other hand, it's also like Stoicism and Epicureanism among the Greeks, which also preached passive acceptance of the disorder of the world and denial of ambition. Stoicism and Epicureanism taught contentment with simple pleasures, following one's instincts about what was right. And again, so it has some affinities with some Roman and Greek religions. Also, it's something like Buddhism in that way. It seems almost more a philosophy than a religion, like Buddhism and Stoicism and Epicureanism. On the other hand, and here, it also, Taoism fostered a rise of natural kinds of arts. Again, the admiration of nature, the search for order, the search for knowledge through nature, and so you see these naturalistic kinds of artwork. These are, again, some naturalistic pots. Here is some naturalistic art that we see that's quite typical of Chinese art. And here's another example of that kind of art. Taoism also stressed the importance of technology, and tradition recognized the importance of technology. The first 5 emperors were credited with the key invention, so a mythology was created that took account for or created myths about the origins of the key technologies of their culture. In 1500 BC, they dated the origin of bronze tools. In 500 BC, they posited that iron arrived, and the Qin may have been the first to use it. And we see a whole range of technologies that appeared in Chinese culture, and these predate actually the same phenomena in European culture by quite a few hundred years. Some of the key inventions were the crossbow, which is much earlier than the European crossbow. The cavalry aided in the fighting off of the crossbow aided the cavalry in fighting off the nomads in the steppes. The watermill was an early invention, and the horse collar was very important. A watermill is important because what it does is apply the power of nature. Again, it's like having electricity. A stream can turn a water wheel and give you power, actually power to run things. And so this is very important. The invention of the horse collar allowed them to use horses as draft animals because a simple yoke would cut off the wind of a horse, and so you need a collar on its shoulders in order to take the power of a horse to draw wagons and carry loads in wagons of that kind. We also have an expanding network of urban centers, and as the empire grows, the population grows. There's a huge growth in population and a rise of prosperity, increasing trade, long-distance commerce, and the Han Empire was very careful to keep a monopoly on the silk producers and the Silk Road as we see the spread of the empire. The Han Empire reached its height under Wu Ti in 141 to 87 BC. But there were problems of the Han government. At its height, it expanded and there were taxes. Taxes were collected throughout the empire. The collection of taxes and the management of labor were state monopolies. There were problems. of the Han government. One of the problems were maintaining the security of the frontiers and the military colonies on the frontiers. And again, this is like the Roman Empire. And here you can see the Silk Road. You can see the early Han Empire and the expansion down the Silk Road. And of course, they got camels actually from the west. In addition to the incursion of, in addition to the spread of Chinese culture westward, you have the introduction of Middle Eastern culture into China, and the camel is one of the symbols of that interaction. Here's a crossbow. This is a European example of a crossbow, but it was first invented by China and probably spread to the European east along the European west along the Silk Road when it reached Europe in much later than it was used in China. There were new social divisions within the Han Empire. There were 4 vocations. You could be a scholar, you could be a farmer, a craftsman, or a trader. And the merchants became the richest. And interestingly, instead of fighting like the soldiers did, fighting the nomads, they bought off the invading nomads. And the scholar bureaucrats really resented the merchants who were prospering seemingly at their expense. Everywhere the Han Empire expanded, they credited it to self-defense. So everywhere they spread their frontiers, they were defending themselves. This is exactly what the Roman Empire did. The more the Roman Empire defended itself, the more it expanded. And one of the major enemies was the Xingnu, who we know in the West as the Huns. And the Huns were attacked by the Chinese. They were actually affected. They lived in the central steppes of Asia, and every time there was a drought in Central Asia, the Huns would go in both directions, and they would attack China and they would attack Europe. And one of the attacks of the Huns was one of the major factors in the crumbling of the Western Roman Empire. So the Huns were nomads who lived on the plains. They had fast little ponies. They lived on mare's milk. They herded cattle and horses, and they affected settled empires in both directions, whichever way they went. The pressure of non-Chinese peoples raiding or moving in led to a decline of the Han authority. They tried to build defensive walls around the empire and around the Silk Road, and they conquered northward. They conquered Manchuria and southern China and Vietnam, sending colonists everywhere. And again, we have the Pax Sinica, similar to the Pax Romana and the Pax Islamica. And here we see some Chinese merchants who were one of the great forces of Chinese expansion. Here is a Chinese merchant, and here is a marketplace where the merchants are selling their goods. Here is Peking, the Tartar city, and this is actually a city that was built by the Tartars when they conquered the Chinese. But you can see they inherited everything of Chinese culture. You can almost see the grid plan of that city as you see the way it's built along straight lines. You can see the straight lines of the streets in that one. And here's a Mongol who would have been one of those nomads threatening the frontier. The pressure of non-Chinese people raiding or moving in led to a decline of the Han authority. And the Han thought of the barbarians, the nomads, as barbarians, just like the Greeks and the Romans did. They thought anyone who was not a Greek or a Roman was a barbarian, and the Chinese felt exactly the same way, anybody who was not Chinese. But there's constant significant trade on the frontiers, and this is true of both the Roman and the Han Empire. And And what you see along the frontiers is a slow assimilation as the nomads traded with the settled people of the empire. They got to know their ways more and more. They envied their prosperity, and they adopted more of the civilized ways, so that by the time you have the internal collapse of the imperial government, and this is true of both Rome and Han China, the nomads who move into that power vacuum when the empire dissolves already were very acculturated into the imperial culture, and this is true in the case of both Rome and Han China. And this is largely through trade. But nomads always have the advantage over settled peoples, and largely this is because of the nobility. It's also because of their poverty. When you think about civilized people, they have a lot of possessions, and they're in one place, and they live in a city, and they prosper. Whereas nomads are free to move around, but they're envious of the possessions that the settled people have, and so this makes them stronger, and the settled people are more vulnerable. Charismatic leaders among these nomads could form alliances, and there was a great alliance that was formed, a great confederacy of the Turkic people called the Xiongnu. And here we see this Mongol. Here we see the walls, the Great Wall of China. There were earlier walls. This is the Great Wall. It was built in the 16th century, but there were earlier walls built along all the boundaries of the Chinese Empire. And here's a gateway in the Great Wall. From Han to Zhou was like Rome. Han was to Zhou like Rome was to Greece, and so we see the kind of comparison that you can make of the Han Empire to the Zhou, the earlier Zhou culture, as Rome was to the earlier Greek culture. Okay, maybe we'll go back to this one. Okay. The Xiongnu was a great confederacy of Turkish people. For centuries, the Chinese had created buffer kingdoms of the nomads and had given them bribes and rewards along the frontiers. And maybe we'll just go back to our Mongol here. In the 1st century AD, the Xiongnu were defeated by the Chinese and were pushed westwards, and several centuries later they arrived in Europe as the Huns. In the end, the cost of continuous military vigilance along the frontier imposed a crushing burden on finances, so that actually in the Chinese Empire, it was the cost of defending those frontiers that were so catastrophic to the Chinese culture. What about the Romans? And again, the Romans also built walls around their empire, trying to keep the barbarians out. But in the Roman Empire, it wasn't the cost of maintaining those frontiers that was so ruinous. It was rather the internal breakdown of the government and the marching of the armies on Rome, although the barbarians did infiltrate the armies. Okay. Economic troubles worsened in the later Han time. In the 1st century AD, a new class of nobles and merchants was arising, and they acquired huge tracts of lands. Peasants were seeking the protection of these new nobles against the government, and strong men independent of state control emerged. The government was deprived of tax revenues and manpower, and the system of military conscription broke down. More mercenaries were hired. In the Han Empire, there was a lot of official corruption and inefficiency and factional intrigues within the ruling Han clan. And this was accompanied by peasant uprisings, the spread of banditry and unsuccessful reform movements, and nomad attacks. So we do have a breakdown of the Han Empire in the same way as the Roman Empire, but the processes were different. I mean, they both broke down, and what can we talk about, is it inevitable that empires will fall? Probably. Then nothing lasts forever, and so, but it's not always the same factors that make them fall. Okay, to sum up, Han is to Zhou like Rome is to Greece. We have political disunity in Greece, in the Greek city-states, only temporarily. Remember that Alexander unified the Greek states in a way that they didn't expect. The Zhou Empire also was affected by political disunity. We have imperial unity with the Roman Empire and the Han Empire. Both of them expressed administrative genius, creating bureaucratic machinery to hold the whole empire together. But the Greek and the Zhou culture were copied by both of the empires. They had a core culture on which they built their own culture. Scholarship flourished under the Han, including antiquarian interests and historical records. Really, the Chinese were the only culture other than the Western culture. If you would talk about the Indo-Europeans who wrote history, the Chinese are the only other culture that actually wrote history. And you have Shi Qi, who wrote a history of China in 130 chapters, and the history of the Han was written later. It expressed the Han Empire as a golden age with sage rulers, maybe like philosopher kings. They also taught events of the past, if not forgotten, are teachings about the future. So there was an interest in historical writing. Events were dated in recurring 60-year cycles or in the reigns of emperors. And again, there's an idea of the cyclical nature of history, that history repeats itself over and over again. And this is why they thought that knowing the events of the past would predict the events of the future, because they felt that history repeated itself. The state sponsored the history of each reign, and they had a concept of archaeological ages. There was first the Stone Age, then the Jade Age, then the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and they saw themselves in the Han Empire as living in the Iron Age. It's in the Han Empire that we have the world's first dictionary, a list of words explained. I think the author of that is Shuo Wen, which means words, which was the first dictionary explaining words. In art, creative realism replaced decoration, so that in the earlier Shang and Zhou, the art was characterized by more decoration. Now we see in the Han Empire the rise of sculpture in relief, and in the round, bronze horses become the subject of sculpture. We see the development of technology to a very high degree, water mills and power bellows, a horse collar. Paper is invented and spreads along the Silk Road and finally reaches Europe. The wheelbarrow was invented in China, and also the seismograph for earthquakes. And here, let's take just a look at a little bit of this naturalistic art. I'm sorry I couldn't get the wrinkles out of this so that you could see the silk embroidery. And remember, the Han Dynasty had a monopoly on silk. This is a jade dragon, the carved three-dimensional jade statue. And here is this naturalistic art. This is examples of it. This is a moth or a butterfly in ceramics. And here's an elephant. Again, this naturalistic kind of art. Landscapes. Again, the interest in nature. Of all kinds. Here's an example of the kind of bronze horses. This isn't bronze, but this is the example of the bronze horses that they would have sculpted. And here's three-dimensional sculpture. The one on the right is more stylized than the one on the left, which is more naturalistic in the Han Empire. We can compare this, for example, to the photographic art of the Roman Empire. Here's a very naturalistic statue. And in another art form of the Roman Empire is this ivory inset into a black lacquered background again, but subject of nature is prominent in this art. And here again you see these three-dimensional kinds of statues that become prominent in the Han Dynasty. And the wheelbarrow is invented for freight as an example of the technology. Here's another wheelbarrow built for two. And this is three-dimensional wood sculpture, which is another medium of Chinese art. Okay. The problems of the Han Empire are security on the frontiers and the military colonies, non-Chinese raiders and immigrants, and they regarded the nomads as barbarians, as we said, but there's constant trade on the frontiers. I mentioned the Sungnu or the Xiongnu, the Confederacy of Turks, that sort of ringed the empire with buffer kingdoms that were kept under control by bribes and rewards. In the 1st century A.D., the Hungnu were defeated and pushed west, and as Huns attacked Europe around 400 A.D. Okay, and so here again is the Han Empire at its greatest extent. Here are some of those nomads on the frontier. These are Mongols, and again we'll talk about the Mongols later as a separate culture pressing in on the Chinese. The military costs were crushing, and these caused the economic troubles in the later Han times. In the 1st century A.D., there's a new class of nobles and merchants rising, as we said. Peasants seek their protection. You can almost compare this process of the weakening of the central monarchy or the central autocracy and the rise of nobles and merchants acquiring local autonomy. You might compare that to the developments of Europe, that with the rise of feudalism, although they're not exactly comparable. But it is a decline of the central power and a rise of local power. Strong men independent of the state, at the same time that the military broke down and hired mercenaries. Okay, there were factional intrigues in the ruling clan, peasant uprisings, banditry, and nomad attacks. So we've looked at China, and we've looked at three ways of thought. We've looked at Confucianism, which is propriety, which stresses propriety, good behavior, following moral principles. We've looked at Taoism as a kind of mysticism, the opposite of reason, the name that cannot be named. And we've looked at legalism, rational laws as the basis of a strong society. In which context of these three ways of thought does the emperor equal harmony? In which ways is the emperor the one who ties them together with harmony, would you say, of these three ways of thought? Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Yeah. Do you have an idea?
I would say legalism, because it's a proponent of strong laws, and a strong leader equals a strong society that's well kept and harmonious.
I would agree with that. I think legalism it puts the emperor first, and we saw at the beginning of the formation of the Han Empire that it formed on the basis of legalism. Which way is most like the United States? You think legalism? Maybe. Want to press your mic?
I don't think it's Taoism.
No, I don't think it's Taoism. Yeah. What do you think?
I think it's the Confucianist because of a kind of like a hierarchical can't speak tonight, kind of like a bureaucratic system that kind of trickles down, federalism and such.
Okay, it's kind of bureaucratic, but I don't think, Confucianism stresses obedience. I don't think Americans are very obedient. Confucianism stresses conformity. Maybe some elements of American society do, but not most of them. Do you think? Taoism definitely not, is very different from the United States, yeah. But legalism is a value in United States culture. Legalism is a value. We value following the laws. Yeah. Which way do you think is predominant to China? We have these three ways of thought in China. Which one do you think predominates over all of China? Yeah, what do you think?
Would it be Confucianism? Because, isn't it pretty strict in China and conformity? And wouldn't that...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Wouldn't it be Confucianism because the conformity, and isn't it pretty strict in China, so wouldn't that fall under kind of Confucianism?
Do you all agree? Everybody agree? I think it depends what class you're in. Legalism still and Confucianism maybe blend together. They're more alike. Taoism is quite different than those two ways of thought. Which of these is the most religious and which the most secular? Which of these three ways of thought is the most religious and which is the most secular?
Legalism would be the most secular, and Taoism would be the most religious.
Everybody agree with that? Yeah, everybody's pretty much in agreement with that. Well, what do you think about the question of the comparison of the Roman Empire and the Han Empire? And the reason I stress that comparison so much is because your textbook stresses that comparison. They actually put the two empires into the same chapter and say that they're essentially pretty much both alike. What do you think about that? Actually, the chapter in your book is called The Age of Empires. And I read that and I thought, no, that's wrong. What did you all think? Does it make sense to compare the Roman Empire and the Han Empire and say they're both the same thing, two of a kind? Yeah.
I think one reason why they're compared so much is that for the West, we romanticize the Roman Empire, and in the East, they probably romanticize the Han a lot more. It's a great cultural and political and technological age for these people.
I think you're really right about that, but if you do that, why do you think, can you think of any objections to the concept? I think that's exactly the reason why they compare the Roman Empire and the Han Empire, because it's a romanticizing of both of them. Why would you argue against the concept that this is the great age of empires and they're both exactly the same kind of empires? Anybody have any reasons why you might object to that? From things we've already done in this class. Yeah.
I would say Han is really, it was so conformist, and the levels of bureaucracy were far greater I would argue, than in the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I think there's. I don't think it's totally conformist, but I think there's a more of an element of conformity in the Han Empire than in the Roman Empire. And certainly, when we looked at the Roman Empire, it was wild and woolly, and you had lots of rebellions going on. which is much more characteristic of the West than the East, although there are rebellions in the East, but there's more in the West, I think. Anything else about the West that doesn't fit this pattern? I mean, I think the comparison is a little bit misleading. Yeah.
The birthright system in the Han Dynasty is quite different than the system the Caesars and
what do you mean by the birthright system?
Well, like the Han Dynasty, it was like family dynasty.
Yeah.
Compared to it lasted a long time. Compared to the Romans, it was just like somebody.
Exactly.
A local noble could take over, essentially.
Yeah, you have a breakdown of the family in the Roman Empire, and so that's a major difference between the two of them, too. The family is so prominent in Chinese culture. It is to this day. And you had the breakdown of the families, even in Greek times you did. And I guess it depends on whether you want to think about, I mean, I made that comparison. It was a comparison made in your book between the Zhou and the Han and the Greek and the Roman. That there are certain forms that are formed in the early cultures that are then picked up and repeated and developed by the later cultures. But the Greek is so different from the Roman Empire. One of the things we saw in the West, in the Western empires, is there's a whole series of empires. In China, there's only this one, the Han, and the Qin lasts one generation. And then you have the Han Empire that lasts for 400 or 500 years, but you don't have a whole lot of other empires. Whereas in the West, we had a whole series of it. What empires did we see in the West? This is a little bit in review for your midterm. What empires did we see in the West before the Roman Empire? Yeah.
Well, before the Roman, it was the Greek, and then you had the Egyptians and Mesopotamians, and there was just several different ones before.
We had a whole series of empires in the West. Starting with the Egyptian, we had the Assyrian, we had the Persian. We had a series of empires that didn't last necessarily very long, but had a lasting impact. And so one might argue Alexander's empire, it only lasted an instant, but it lasted longer than the government of Alexander's empire because you had Hellenism spread all over that whole area, and then the Romans sort of bought into that and absorbed that Hellenism, which became part of the Roman government too. So you have you can even talk about, if you talk about the autocracy of the Chinese empire, the discipline being stronger, the rule being stronger in China, the loyalty and obedience being stronger in the people in China, but you can talk about the concept of empire being longer lasting and more widespread in the West. You see, these are the kinds of comparisons you need to make on your midterm. Okay, because on your questions on your midterm, you're not going to be asked to tell me everything you know about Rome. You're going to be asked to compare empires, compare environments in which they're formed, compare religions between many different cultures. Where do religions come from? What function do they fulfill in a society? That kind of a question. Do you have a comment? No? You're just thinking about the midterm. so that when you study for the midterm, I mean, don't just go over the lecture and look at one government. And so this is why I was trying to do a lot of comparison tonight. Compare and contrast one culture with several others, more like how do governments form and on what rationale are they developed? Why do some cultures develop autocracies, like China did, like Han China did? And why do other governments develop democracies, like we see in Greece and Rome? Why does autocracy succeed or break down? In China, it actually broke down. It didn't last forever. That democracies also broke down. We saw the democracies of Greece and Rome disintegrate, almost in meltdown almost. And so why does that happen? Why does that happen? So that you should look at governments, you should look at religions, you should look at environments, geography, performing cultures, anything else you might look at, and their roles in the development of the culture. Okay, we're almost done. Any questions, comments, worries about the midterms? Yeah.
You're going to want us to turn in the outline that...
Oh, your prospectus for the paper? Yeah, you turn that in on the night of the midterm. So you can work on that up until the night of the midterm.
You just want it typed?
Pardon?
Just want it typed prospectus?
Oh, yeah, we definitely want it typed. Yeah, not handwritten. Okay. So, you're in college now. Never turn in anything handwritten except your exam. And so we'll have blue books for you here for the exam. We'll have blue books. Okay. Yeah.
We can have 2 internet sites, a total of, or a minimum of 5, both primary and secondary, right?
Yeah. And don't list. I mean, you may use your readings books, The Human Record and the Global Experience, which are full of primary sources. They have wonderful primary sources in them, and you may use those on your papers. But you should have additional books that you've gone to the library to get or Googled to find the names of books that you can use. It's better to go to the library. Just go to the catalog and put your subject in and find some books that relate to what you're doing, and go to the library and go where they're located and look at the shelves, and you'll see a lot more. Yeah.
I know that for the paper, when we use our primary sources, especially when we're getting it out of a reader, that we're going to need to individually cite those primary sources. But for right now, if we're not sure, we're going to use 2 or, et cetera, how many we might use in a reader, is it okay to just put as our primary source that collection for right now on the prospectus, and then we can narrow it down later on? Yeah,
that's okay if you put, for example, if you put the human record down, because for each of the cultures any of the cultures you might be looking at, there will be primary sources that you can get out of the human record if you're not sure what sources you're going to use. But go to the library and find other primary sources, and you can look in some of the references for these to find other sources. The introductions to the primary sources mention a lot of other things, and if you have an excerpt from something, like tonight we mentioned The City of God, well, that's a huge book. You can find a lot of things in that, and you only have a small excerpt. So there are you can look in here to find more primary sources. Yeah.
On the bibliography, where we have a primary source and it's translated by someone. Yeah. Okay. Do I need to list that translator on my works cited, on the bibliography? Do I need to put their name in the information of that book?
For your prospectus, I don't think you need to be that precise. You don't have to have real footnotes for your prospectus. You can just list the primary source that you're going to use. Obviously, most of you will be working with translations. I don't think any of you will be reading, some of you may be reading in original languages, but most of you will be using...
I noticed there was one that had like the translator's name or whatever. That does not need to go on the description of the source.
Not for the prospectus. You can just list, for example, say you're going to use St. Augustine, the City of God. Just put St. Augustine, the City of God. Now, when you write your final term paper to turn it in, then you will need a complete citation showing the edition that you're using, who translated it, what press published it, and what year it was published. That should be a normal scholarly footnote. But for your prospectus, just right now, this is preliminary. This is preparing to write the paper. And what we want to do is to make sure you're not going in the wrong direction, you're not getting off on the wrong foot, that you understand what you're supposed to do in order to write the paper. This is to help you write a better paper, okay? But you get a grade on it, so do a good job. And the grade is actually equal to your other 3 grades. So you want to do a good job on your prospectus. So really think about your paper, and this will help you write a better paper when you go to write it. You'll have done some preliminary work on it. Any more questions on the exam or the paper? Feel pretty confident? Okay. Good. We'll see you next week then.